this subject in the Quran. It comes in a very important verse dealing with some other rights, the rights of the yatim or the orphans. This is called Surah An-Nisa, which is the chapter about the women. It begins by telling us not to do something that was the custom of the time, which was to marry little orphan girls in order to inherit their wealth, so that if a child's parents died, some tribal leader could come along and say, well, I'm going to marry this girl, and she's only 2 years old or 4 years old. I'm going to marry her. I'm going to take her wealth, and I have the right, because they treated women worse than animals, and if they married them, they treated them less than their sheep or goats. So women really didn't have rights back then. So when Islam is coming now, it's saying, first of all, the rights of the orphans, the rights of these little children to have their wealth. It tells us that we can't take their wealth and mingle it with our own, hoping to increase our own position. So this is something that we begin with, mentioning that. And read the verse to them, because it does start out by saying, and anytime a verse starts with the word and, it's only fair that we should look at the verse before it to see what is the continuum of the ayah or the verse. Okay? Because it is dealing with the subject here of how we treat orphans and their wealth. And it's saying for sure that you cannot marry these girls and take their wealth away from them. Rather, you should marry other women of your choice. And then it continues by saying, Ithnin, which is 2, Thalat, which is 3, Arba, which is 4. And it says, if you can treat them with equality. Otherwise, you can marry only one. Well, actually, there are limits now which are being set forth in this ayah. The limit, first of all, is that you can only marry 2 or 3 or 4, provided that you will treat them with equality. Otherwise, you can only marry 1. The first limit is the number, because prior to Islam coming, there was no limit whatsoever on how many wives you could have. The men of those days had many wives. Some of them had so many they couldn't count them, maybe more wives than they had sheep or goats. So the first thing that happened for the Muslims was not that they ran out and said, oh, wow, we can get a bunch of wives. It was the opposite. They said, oh, dear, we have to divorce wives that we have. The number must be 4 or less, and I can only keep wives that I can treat with equality. Of course, this is talking about financial more so than anything else. You have to treat them in such a way that each has the same type of house, clothing, transportation, food, etc. It's not permissible in Islam to favor one over the other in these areas. So obviously it's going to be very difficult for anybody to have more than one wife. But what is the real limit that we're talking about here? The real limit here is one that's even bigger than that. And when we understand this and present it in the correct way, this then will be what's called the hikmah of Islam, the wisdom in Islam. And it's why so many people, really, when they come to understand the answers to these questions, not only do they comply and say, this is nice, thank you very much, many of them will enter into Islam. And we want to break this down and give you the parts to it so that you can understand it better, so that you can deal with these questions yourself. We'll be back after this, and I want you to think about what we said and see how you would have responded to this same question. Why can a man have 4 wives and a woman can only have 1 husband? We'll be back after this, and then we'll discuss it more. Bismillah. We're back. We've been talking on the subject of lifting the fog, dealing with the misconceptions, misunderstandings about what is Islam and who are the Muslims. I'm your host, Yusuf Estes. We've been breaking down one particular subject, and we'd like to treat each one by one through this series. But always we're going to come back with the same initial intent, and that is to present Islam correctly and at the same time encourage the people to understand what is Islam, who is Allah, and what's our responsibility, our purpose in life. The question we were talking about in this case is the one about why can a man have 4 wives, but a woman can only have 1 husband? We broke it down in the beginning by saying that the first thing to start with is saying, thank you for asking me about my religion. This does 2 things. One, it changes the tone of the whole thing from being one of animosity toward one of being a little bit more subtle and a little bit more pleasant. The second thing that it does, it gives us a chance to present it as a real answer to a real question. We begin then by mentioning Islam is the truth, and we must say the truth, or else we'll be held accountable on the day of judgment for it. So we're not going to lie. The other thing is that we have the authentic, preserved answers to all of these questions in the Quran and in the teachings of Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. So it's already there. When we come to the question, then, we make sure that we straighten the question out and remove the obstacles within the question itself, because many times people say something in the question that's not correct. So before we begin to answer a question, we analyze the question and remove the things which are not true or influence the statement in such a way that there's no way you can really answer from the standpoint of Islam. The next thing we do is explain to them that the answers to questions in Islam provide more than just a little bit of understanding. They give us direction and understanding of who is our Creator and what our purpose of life is. So that when they're at the end of the answer to the question, it should be that they realize that the impact of this answer on them should have a profound effect. And we should ask them, are you going to be prepared at the end of the answer to this question? If you hear things that you like, if you see things here that are things that you say, well, this is something good for me, I'd like that to be a part of my life, then are you going to be prepared to consider worshiping your Lord alone without any partners? Because you see, that's what Islam is really all about. Now we'll come back to this question that we've been talking about. Why can a man have 4 wives and a woman can only have 1 husband? I want to give you a little something that happened to me one time at a university. A woman stood up, an elderly woman, rather large woman. She said, I want to know something. How come you Muslim men can have 4 wives and a woman can only have 1 husband? I said, excuse me, ma'am, are you married? She said, yeah. I said, okay, why don't you do this? Right now, I want you to imagine your husband. She said, why? I said, no, just for a minute. Imagine your husband. He's coming home from work, right? He comes to his favorite chair, sit down, relax. You have to serve him, take care of him, so and so. You just get this guy in your mind, okay? Just imagine him. She said, and? I said, you got him in your mind? She said, yeah. I said, okay, how would you like to have another one just like him? She said, no way. I said, well, then why you want 4? But this really is not the best answer for them. I'll tell you why. Because this isn't the way the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would have answered the question. It's a very direct question. It needs a direct answer. The reason in Islam for the 4 wives is not for the man as much as it is for the woman. And you have to understand that Islam is not just about what I want, but it's also about what you want. So there are rights and there are limits. Everybody has their rights, but there are limits. Let me explain. Islam forbids a man to marry a woman who's already married.